activity versus inner communion. Could you take a moment to close your eyes and think of these two words, activity, or these two concepts, activity versus inner communion. What do you think of or feel in response to these two ideas or these two aspects of life, activity and inner communion? What do they bring up in you? Is it a sense of perhaps tension between activity and inner communion? I would like to have more inner communion, but I have too much activity. Or I enjoy activity and I'm not sure what inner communion would do for me. Or I feel inner communion in my activity and I'd like to feel more. If any of these strikes a chord with you or a resonance, see if there's a question that arises. How can I balance my activity and inner communion, for example? Or very specific things related to your job or your family or something going on in your life right now. Okay, you can open your eyes now. And I wanted to begin with a quote from the Bhagavad Gita and also from the Bible. And the reason for sharing both of these, I'm going to be reading you a story from Rays of the One Light, which is parallel commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. The reason to share the story from the Bible is for two reasons. One is that it is the sort of classic story, the essential story on this question or this apparent conflict between activity and inner communion. And also, if you are familiar with the Bible, no doubt you're familiar with this story and the teachings of Jesus in it. If you are not familiar, it can be helpful actually to study this story, not only of course because it relates to the life of Jesus, who was a great avatar yogi also, but in addition because sometimes when we study a story outside our own tradition, we come to it fresh. We don't have, if it is outside your tradition I should say, we don't have any context, unnecessary context. We don't have preconceived impressions of it. It hasn't been shouted at us, or we haven't heard it over and over and over again. It's fresh. And so in that way, sometimes you see that people in the West or people who are not familiar with the Gita find great inspiration from it because they come to it willingly as spiritual seekers without any baggage, you might say. And similarly, we find a lot of enthusiasm for the teachings of Christ, especially when they're presented clearly. Because in India or in places where people aren't as familiar, or with people who aren't as familiar, I myself growing up was not as familiar with the teachings of Christ, and so when I came across his words, I found them very helpful. Let he who is without fault or without sin cast the first stone of criticism, meaning that we all have something to work on, and so let us not judge unkindly or unfairly our brothers and sisters. So let me read to you this story, and it is about Martha and Mary, two disciples of Jesus. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. In the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 10, we read a passage that Yogananda often quoted. In fact, I was reading the wrong reading. How about that? So now I'll continue with the right reading. This one doesn't say Yogananda often quoted it. One of the most famous stories in the Gospels is that of Martha and Mary. Jesus, visiting the home of Martha, was teaching while her sister Mary sat at his feet, absorbing his divine love and wisdom. Oh, in fact, I have a slide here that can stimulate our imagination. I'll read that again. One of the most famous stories in the Gospels is that of Martha and Mary. Jesus, visiting the home of Martha, was teaching while her sister Mary sat at his feet, absorbing his divine love and wisdom. Martha, meanwhile, busied herself with serving her guests and was upset with Mary for not helping her. "Lord," she cried, "doesn't it matter to you that my sister has left me to do all this serving alone? Please ask her to help me." "Martha, Martha," Jesus answered, "thou art careful and troubled about many things. But one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her." And you can imagine that this painting is that exact moment. This story is classic, for Martha's complaint is very understandable, and not, on the surface of it, spiritually wrong. Jesus may well have told Mary to get up and help her. We don't really know that he didn't, considerate as he always was of others' needs. But the teaching here doesn't concern the obvious dilemma of devotees, to work for God or to spend all one's time in prayer. It concerns rather the attitude of the mind. Jesus didn't tell Martha, "Martha, you are doing too much." He told her rather, "You are letting your work affect your inner peace." That was the contrast. Not work versus not work versus contemplation, but restless preoccupation versus peaceful absorption under all circumstances. As it says in, I'll pause right there. So this story gives us a beautiful teaching in the apparent conflict again between activity versus inner communion. Because we may feel that, yes, I would love to spend all my time in inner communion, but all this darn activity troubles me or gets in the way or seems to detract from all of that. And certainly it can be true if we have a lot of demands on our time, if we have a lot of obligations, or if we have a lot of people who are asking us, "Why do this for me, do that for me, do this, oh, and don't forget the other thing that you've already neglected," then we may ask, where is time for meditation? Or if we'd like to meditate longer than 5 minutes a day, we're saying, I'm going to need to cut out some activity, it seems, and I don't know how. So certainly a devotee struggles with how to balance these two things. But the teaching in this story, one of them, for there are many, is that it isn't so much that we should feel that when I'm active, I am not communing inwardly. And when I am communing inwardly, I can only do so by being inactive. That it's the attitude with which we act. We want to again unite these two things. Swamiji tells the story of meeting a banker in Australia who took Swamiji into his meditation room and showed it to him, and he said, "This is where I live. During the day, I go to my office and do all my duties, but when I come home, I change my clothing and I come into my meditation room, and that's when my day begins." And Swamiji, I don't think he said it, but he thought, how sad. In the sense that why not have your day begin in the morning, not in the evening at the end of everything? In other words, we don't want to see a dichotomy, a separation between living for God in meditation and living for God out in the world, in the duties that in a very real sense He Himself has given us through our karma and through the fastest way that we can get out of that karma. And so of course you may be saying that's all well and good, but how? And we will be getting into that next. So this next quote is from the Gita. And if you're not familiar with the Bhagavad Gita, it is a discussion between Arjuna, who is pictured in the higher seat, and Krishna, who is God incarnate, who is his charioteer in this picture. And this is in the middle of the Mahabharata war of India. They have this discussion. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita, the 2nd chapter, Krishna says, "Actions performed under the influence of desire are greatly inferior to those which are guided by wisdom. Happiness eludes people when they act from self-interest. Seek shelter, therefore, in the equanimity of wisdom." And already we get some hints from that in terms of acting desirelessly and also watching out for attachment and so on. I'd like to read a little more from this book, The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita, which is Swamiji's writing of Yoganandaji's commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita. And relating to this passage, he writes the following. The solution to this dilemma is not to refrain from acting. Some people, many hermits for example, think to develop spiritually by refraining from all action. That idea is a delusion. As long as one must breathe, think and move, he cannot rightly claim to be inactive. The yogi who sits breathless and motionless in samadhi is a different case. To go beyond action, you must merge your consciousness in the cosmic sound of Om, allowing it to act through you and around you until you merge in that infinite vibration, and then pass beyond vibration itself into the calm consciousness of the Supreme Spirit. As long, however, as you are conscious of having a body, you will only be depriving yourself if you try to achieve the actionless state by not acting. All you will become in time is lazy and dull-minded. And I wanted to just pause here and comment how in the Christian teaching, which is more rooted in the West, the Master is saying, now don't be so busy all the time, make sure that you also have inward communion, and to Martha. And in the Gita, we are getting, in this commentary that is more addressed to the East, it's saying, now don't think you can just meditate all the time, you have to also act. Now of course it's fun to think of these two as stereotypes, but of course there is no such thing as a stereotype when it comes to an individual. Teaching is individual. And so for those of us who are more inclined to say all is Brahman and therefore I need not do anything, well, we might want to think about doing something, or in particular again, bringing the consciousness of Brahman into our action. Because after all, isn't God extremely active in this universe? As Master said, He is throbbing in your heart. And so He's just in that motor of our body. Of course, the heart is more than a motor, but it has that physical function that is just keeping us going. He's very active in our own intimate lives, even on a fundamental level. And He does so while remaining in bliss, and so let us try for that. On the other hand, if we are just active and restless and so on, and not seeking that inner communion, remember Jesus said that is the better part. So even though we are creating a way to integrate these two things, of the two, the most important is inner communion. To reach God, one must first learn to act without selfish motive, for God, not for personal reward. Indeed, it is necessary to be intensely active for God, if one would develop that intense awareness, which alone lifts one to superconsciousness. Lazy people will not find God. In everything you do, however, and this is how to do it, feel that God is acting through you. Wash your body, feed it, give it rest. Do everything that is needful to maintain the body in good health and filled with energy. But always feel, it is God I am serving through this physical instrument. The very enjoyment of good food, of beautiful scenery, of the good things of life can be offered up to God. Share those enjoyments with Him instead of depriving yourself of them. What needs to be released are the thoughts, I am doing, I am enjoying, and even the thought, it is I who am suffering. Even in meditation, it is important not to meditate with desire for the results. To eliminate the strain and tension of trying to concentrate, release also the thought, I am meditating. Think rather, the cosmic vibration is reaffirming, through me, its own reality. Cosmic love through me is yearning for God's love. Cosmic joy through me is cosmic joy through me is rejoicing in our infinite beloved. So, how do we put this into practice? I want to return to this statement of Jesus. You are letting your work affect your inner peace. So clearly this is the conflict, and you might say, well, I knew that at the very beginning of this whole discussion. I knew that I would have inner peace if it weren't for all this work. So that was a pretty elaborate setup for something that's already a given. But, it's important to see that both Christ and Krishna emphasized this question and its answer. So in other words, yes, it is a question for us in our own lives. It was a question for Jesus' disciples in his life. It was a question for Arjuna, the disciple of Krishna. In other words, it's an eternal question. So you're in good company with these others who are seeking God and having the same challenge. So again, one more reason not to feel badly about it, and know this really is one of the big tests. In fact, when our inner communion becomes constant throughout all our activity, then we have God. So it really is the only question, in a way. Now, the point again made by Swami Kriyananda in the reading, the commentary, is that the real conflict is between restless preoccupation versus peaceful absorption under all circumstances. So these are the two that we want to see how to move from one to the other, to move from restlessness to peaceful absorption. It's not activity in itself versus inward communion. Those are not in conflict. So, let's see, are we going to advance here? Oh, there we go. I wanted to just share a few teachings of Swami Kriyananda on this subject, things that he has found helpful. What he said in a course which is entitled Material Success Through Yoga Principles, and intended specifically on bringing inner communion into our activity, is this: that in business we often consider the bottom line, the final arbiter, the thing that decides everything, as profit. Monetary profit. What money is the bottom line in business often, and if not always, but it's not the true bottom line in the cosmos. But if we're not careful, we can think of it as the bottom line in our own lives. Sometimes when we have fears around money, we let those fears run us and decide how we're going to even behave. And there's a story of a man, master meaning Yogananda, told of a man who was dying, and they were filling the lamp next to his bed, pouring more oil into the lamp so that it would burn longer. And he said, "Why put so much oil in that lamp?" Meaning it was a waste. And Master said his own oil, this man's own oil of life, was running out, and still he was concerned that they might be spending too much on oil in his last moments. It's a gripping delusion, and one that we have to remember. God made money, God made the lamp, God made the oil, God is in us, and He is the true source of wealth and security, as Master once had a vision of Divine Mother saying to him, after someone had, I think, criticized or threatened the organization financially, she said to Yogananda, "I am your stocks and bonds." So, in Swamiji's life, though he was a Swami, though he was a monk, he was at the center of many enterprises, and many people were depending on him through his books, through his teaching of classes, through many of his outward activities for their spiritual welfare, but also for their material welfare in terms of the mortgage payments on the property here at Ananda Village. I'm actually speaking from America at Ananda Village. It's about 7:30 in the morning right now. And so the demands that Swamiji had placed on him were about as intense as any family man or woman or business executive and so on. And so he made as his bottom line not monetary profit, but inner peace. He said, if this action, if this activity disturbs my inner peace, then I will refrain from it. Now you of course have to understand that in the right way. It doesn't mean he was never tested, he was never stretched, he was never challenged. It's not that kind of peace. That's passive peace. Leave me alone, I'm fine the way I am, and I don't want one more thing to come and disturb that peace. Sure, we can have moments like that. It's human. But that isn't the dynamic spiritual growth of peace and calmness. And so inner peace is to say, let us not sacrifice our inner peace for any reason. What that means is we can have inner peace under every circumstance. I know that's a big statement, and you can probably think of 4 or 5. Well, no, not in this circumstance you can't, and not in that one either. No. But in fact, we are not required by outward circumstances to react in a certain way. In other words, if someone says an unkind thing to us, it can be tempting to respond, or to be hurt, or to have our inner peace shaken. And this is something I myself struggle with. I'm not at all saying, look, I've mastered that. But just to say, sometimes when I feel upset, or that temptation to become even more upset, I remind myself, just because this other person is in a bad mood, it does not obligate me to also be in a bad mood. It does not require me to respond at the same level of energy. I can choose my response. And I imagine sometimes Swami Kriyananda or Yoganandaji facing that person who just did something unkind or unpleasant. And I could imagine Swamiji saying, having a bad day? Or something like that, without any disturbance of his inner peace. So, in terms of the demands of our outward activity and how to balance them, or how to integrate inner peace into that, these are a few suggestions that Swamiji shares. I'll go back to that. The first is, he says, don't let yourself be drawn into other people's priorities. Now we want to understand that in the right way. In other words, it can be very tempting when we're trying to concentrate on something and then someone jumps in and says, oh, I have to tell you something, and so on, that to then lose our concentration and follow what they're saying. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that we be rude and someone comes in and said, I have an emergency, I have to tell you something. No, I am concentrating right now. Of course not. It's not like that. If there's a fire in the building, we may do well to listen to them, because that has become our priority as well. And Swamiji makes this point that obviously if there was someone in need, especially in spiritual need, then his priority changed to become that person's welfare. That became his highest priority. So it isn't that once we've fixed our priorities, then we never change them no matter what. Obviously not. At the same time, we can get emails that are about all kinds of news that are not relevant to what we're doing right now. Sometimes it's helpful to turn off email if you get a lot of emails each day, and if you have email always on, because it's just a stream of interruption. And it may be hard sometimes to turn it off, especially if you say, well, my computer might explode if my boss discovered that I had turned off my email. But the thing is that even for short periods, even a half an hour, it can be very restful not to have that constant pop or blue dot or however your email appears, coming to either distract you or to tempt us. To say, oh, what's that happening? Oh, really, there's a sale on shoes. How about that? I don't really need to know that. You can take it all in one chunk at different times. I have found it very peaceful to have that practice. And so if you are feeling stressed or harried or just it's constantly happening like this and you sit in front of a computer for a long time each day, try this experiment of either turning off your email or hiding it, even for 15 minutes, just to feel that peace that can come. And it can rejuvenate you as well. So be aware of the temptation to be drawn into other people's priorities. It doesn't mean to be uncooperative and so on. But Swamiji also gives the example of he would receive many letters that needed response, and he wouldn't always answer them right away. He said, well, if he needed to, he said to himself, after all, I didn't ask this person to write to me, and so it's okay if I take some time to respond. And so some things that seem urgent are only urgent because the person asking the question is in an urgent state of mind. Sometimes it's better for them to work it out on their own. Sometimes our input isn't actually needed, and they will benefit from either working it out on their own or talking to someone else. All of this weighed against being sensitive to others and helping, because sometimes it may be God coming to us saying, I would like you to heal this person, or to be a friend, or just to listen. And as Master said, in the Bible it says that one day out of the week we are not supposed to do any work. It's called the Sabbath. And Jesus spoke saying that if your I think it's if your cow falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, will you not do the work to rescue it, to recover it from the ditch? And Master took it so far as to say, if you find a human being in a ditch, do you come up to them and say, oh, I'm so sorry, it's the Sabbath, you've got to die. I can't help you. And Master said, God is in that person, and God will say, what's the matter with you? I'm lying here and you don't help me. So again, we have to balance these two, but you'd probably know which side of this equation you tend more to be on. Always wanting to help and always dropping what you're doing to help others, or doing that more often than not, then saying, how can I pull a little more inward? And then similarly saying, I have no problem ignoring other people. Well, then maybe saying, maybe what new experiences are coming to me through this person. Another suggestion Swamiji gives is to develop a team of assistants who can act on your behalf. Now you might say, oh, well, that's lovely. I'm an assistant acting on someone else's behalf. I would certainly love to have my own team of assistants. Or I don't even work in a corporate setting like that, so I'm just in my family. But families, for example, have all kinds of situations where we have assistants who can act on our behalf if we can cultivate them. Children, for example, if their enthusiasm can be engaged, would love to do things and could do other things even on our behalf. I remember when I got my driver's license and was able to drive my own car, my parents were thrilled, and my dad said to me, go get some milk. He was so happy that he could just point, at the empty milk container, and that suddenly I would drive away and return with the milk. And I was thrilled for any opportunity to drive, so it worked out well for a time. So you can cultivate that in your children. Obviously, children, especially nowadays, will enjoy younger children easily, and older children too. Anything that you do together. That's one of the things that modern life has been doing, is pulling us apart. I don't mean it in a tragic sounding way, but just saying that it's not so much we're even being physically separated, we're just being simultaneously distracted. If I were, it wouldn't be perhaps so uncommon for me in the middle of the webinar, oh, sorry, I have one SMS I have to answer. I'm kidding, I don't. But you see how, in fact, it can be so common that these devices, this is a phone, just can engage us. And sometimes, I know of a story of a man who was so wedded to his phone, he came home after working very long hours. He was exhausted, and he wanted to fall asleep in the bed, but he missed the bed and just didn't hit the floor, but laid down on the floor, fully clothed, and just fell asleep and began snoring. And his wife came in and said, listen, you got to wake up. You get undressed, get in the bed, you'll have a proper sleep. Wake up. She called his name. She spoke to him in a loud voice. She shook him. Wake up. Listen, you've got to wake up. And no response, just the snoring continued. And so she paused a moment, she had an idea, and she picked up her phone and she called him. Hello! And go to bed. So, I think the story speaks for itself. The next suggestion, the third suggestion, the final one I'll share right now, is that Swami Kriyananda says, refuse to worry over decisions that are important but can't be faced yet. Sometimes we have very big things looming on the horizon, but their time for decision or action has not yet come. Maybe we have an application to submit. Maybe we have an exam to sit for. Maybe we have a presentation we're going to give. These are simple examples, but maybe we have a maybe we have a family problem that we're going to have to confront someone about, lovingly, hopefully, but we're nervous about it. Though it's important to prepare for such experiences, it's equally important not to worry about them in advance when there's nothing else that can be done in this moment. Far better, Swamiji recommends, for us to concentrate on whatever is in front of us and to pour all of our energy into that activity, partly because when you focus your energy increases. And so, far from saying, oh, I'm actually wasting time on this other thing instead of what I should be worrying about, instead, when we concentrate on something like that, we find our energy levels increasing and also not wasting away in friction. Worry is really just friction. Or if you want to think of it, spinning our wheels, not going anywhere, rubbing our hands together and feeling the heat. If you rub your hands, you can feel the heat of friction there. That's just wasted energy in a way when thought of purely physically. It's not being used for anything. And so far better for us to concentrate and be in the moment. It has the added advantage, Swamiji says, especially when we're under a deadline and pressure. He said, do one thing at a time. And that goes against the modern thought and philosophy of multitasking and parallel processing and all these things. But why do one thing at a time? He said, doing so will calm you. And it's a very helpful practice. I recommend it. The next time you feel pressure to get 5 things done before you leave for the airport or whatever it is, do one thing at a time and see if the calmness doesn't come. And this brings us to that slide that I skipped. Why make inner peace the bottom line? Certainly as yogis, as truth seekers, as devotees, we can say, sure, yeah, I would like to do that. But even on a practical level, even from the most sort of prosaic or materially minded philosophy, inner peace is helpful and useful because when we have our inner peace, we can concentrate. When we concentrate, we tend to make far fewer mistakes, or rather, if we make mistakes, we tend to catch them before anyone else does. And also we can come up with new ideas or cut to the heart of an issue without having to deliberate and go through all kinds of one horsepower thinking. We can cut right to the heart of a situation and come up with the solution with the calmness of mind and concentration. And this other point mentioned here is calmness. Why is calmness useful? Well, so many problems in our lives come from when we are not calm. And We react, for example, emotionally in a way that we regret or a way that we would not respond if we had been calm, again, speaking personally. And then there's damage control and cleanup, and I'm sorry, I didn't really mean it, what can I do? We have to spend sometimes a day cleaning up a mess that we made because we weren't calm. It doesn't mean, yes, and the other person should be calm too. That's their business, that's their job. And sometimes God has sent them to us, and maybe even given them a bad mood so that to test our calmness. And so think of it as a game, never disrespecting the other person, of course. We want to be charitable, and that helps us to be calmer. But to say, okay, God is trying to get my goat. And as Yogananda said, your goat is your peace, So I'm not going to give him my goat. This is my goat of peace. Of course, it's getting a bit silly now. But to say, I'm going to hang on to my calmness and see how far I can go. This was actually a real test that Yogananda would put his disciples and students through. Take a test, a difficult situation, and take them to the breaking point of their losing their patience, of losing their tolerance. Not of course, to torture them, but to see and to have them see which way they would break. Would they break in favor of calmness, surrender, a good-natured laugh, or would they break in terms of irritability, losing their equilibrium, and so on? And he's still doing that to his disciples and students, those of you who are, and God is also. Not because God wants to test us and say, I don't know how you're feeling and I need to find out. He knows how we're feeling, even better than we know. But he wants us to see. In this situation, I was able to remain calm, and I don't know how. I did it, but I was. From that we can take a lot of courage. And, of course, which I'm sure you've experienced, it's very attractive to be around a calm person. So when we develop and expand that calmness within us, we will find people gravitating towards us, not just family members and maybe not even family members, but maybe one day, but our children, of course, if we have them, and our friends and colleagues. You will find that, as I'm sure you've already found, the calmer you are, the more people will come to you, if not even with questions and in thoughts, but with just a desire to be in your presence. There's one man, there's many people at Ananda who have this quality, but there was one man in particular in a community I was living in. We would sometimes have the most tense meetings around the difficult topics that people were struggling with at that time. The whole group was struggling with. And when this man was in the meeting, everyone became calmer. The same objections were raised, the same knotty problems, meaning like a knot, like a rope tied in a knot, were still there and worked on, but everyone did so sort of one intensity level lower, with this much more calmness, because his presence was like a shading tree, and everyone felt, well, I will be heard, truth will be heard, and even if I don't like the outcome, this happened to me personally, I didn't even like the decision that was made, and I also didn't like the fact that I had to accept it because I knew it was right. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was right, and it was born out of this calmness. It calmed even my own reaction to say, well, after all, it is the right thing to do, and so here we go. And I was grateful for that addition of that man's presence. And so we can be that to others, but most importantly to ourselves. So I'd like to take time now to answer any questions that you might have, and I'll just put a picture of Yoganandaji on the screen. This is again to re-emphasize that he integrated his spiritual life with his outward activity, and often he would travel in America in this way, dressed in an overcoat, dressed in a business suit. He said, I have a way of tying my hair and tucking it into my collar that you will never know that I have long hair. And this was a picture of one time when he was doing that. So So again, he was fully integrated, and we can strive for that too. So, any questions?
Thank you, Dharmarajan. One of the questions that came in from the audience: sometimes inner communion takes precedence over outward activity. Is it okay? Is it okay to drop the worldly duties to be constantly in inner communion?
Well, it's very tempting to say yes, and in some cases I think the answer is yes. But of course, there are particular situations, and there's also what perspective we're coming from. In other words, what is our need for growth, as I was mentioning before. If we're more inclined to be in that inner communion constantly and not have enough outward activity, then we need to look at that. But for most of us, we're swamped with activity, and then sometimes we'll feel a need for more inner communion. We'll feel that need all the time, but we'll feel even a desperation. I need some peace. I need to take time away from people, to take time away from my demands, just to recharge, and so on. It is important when you feel a strong urge like that to honor it if possible. Listen for God's response, because you want to make sure it's the soul crying out, not the ego crying out, saying, I'm tired of this work, so I'm going to say, it's time to be more spiritual, so therefore I don't have to work so hard. Oh, great, now I'm being spiritual. But seriously, if it's coming from the soul, coming from the heart, we need to honor that. There was a project that was happening in Yogananda's lifetime among some of the disciples, and one of the disciples who was leading the project didn't show up for work that day. And when Yogananda saw him later, he said, "Where were you?" And the man said, "Sir, I was meditating." And Yogananda said, "Oh, why didn't you say so?" He knew in that particular case that was a better use of the man's time, and it didn't matter what all other needs, demands, and so on were waiting for him. That was the time to go deep. And all those demands for the most part can wait a day or two or a week, and they're still just there, and they'll be resolved. If someone can't have you meet their needs, they may have someone else meet their needs. It works out usually just fine. We're not as indispensable as we are made to think by others and by ourselves. So there is that, although there's one other aspect of the question, which is, can we step away from activity for constant inner communion? Yes, if we can maintain that constant inner communion. And that's the crux, is that most of us on this earth are not able to remain constantly communing with God without also doing some outward activity. And I don't know if that was a part of your question personally, but it is a general question. That's why we need service. That's why we need to think of others and so on, because we're not able, most of us, to sit in a cave for 24 hours a day, locked in that communion. And so it's not that that's the higher growth, and so because we can't have the higher growth, we have to do this lower growth. You can find God in activity. Yogananda's second most advanced woman disciple never meditated at all. And Swami Kriyananda asked him, "Sir, how can she be so advanced when she's not meditating?" And Yoganandaji said, "I'm meditating for her." And so it's not, I wouldn't say let's look to her as an example. Thank God now I don't have to meditate and I can be the second most advanced. Obviously not. But just to say, every time we make up a rigid rule, God will come up with a counterexample, just to prove that He can't be hemmed in by any superficial rigidity or restrictions that way. So, next question.
Thank you. What are some practical ways we can learn to control the reactive process?
A very good question. There is a simple technique known all over the world of when you feel the reaction bubbling up, see if you can step away from the situation and count to 10 and do some deep breathing before responding. And we have a policy at Ananda, not a policy, but a practice that Swami Kriyananda recommended, especially in an argument. He said, don't talk right away, but do talk. So in other words, when emotions are running high, that may not be the best time to just fire the bullets that are ready to come out of our mouths. But at the same time, sitting on them, or sitting on those feelings or those thoughts or the grievances or the point we're trying to make forever is also not useful. It's helpful to have that communicated, and it honors the other person, and saying, I respect your own desire to know the truth and your own willingness to work this out, rather than, that's fine, I'll do it. No, fine, no problem. Meanwhile, until the steam comes out of our ears. So that's one way. Another way, which almost ends up being the answer to just about every question, is to try to meditate more. Not in the moment necessarily when our emotions are all disturbed and upset. In that case, it's better to go for a walk, get some air, move the body again. That will ground us and try to draw some of that energy back into the body, and be naturally calming. Change of scenery, maybe especially a change of scenery from this person's face, will help us to calm down. But also, the more we meditate regularly, the more that calmness comes, the more that emotional reactivity, that flashpoint, becomes lesser and lesser. And we find ourselves harder to ruffle just naturally. This happened to me yesterday. I was at a store and I was trying to buy something with a credit card, and the machine wasn't working. So they went to use the backup machine, which used a phone line. And the backup machine wasn't working either. And they picked up the phone on the same line and they heard a fax sound, like a fax machine, that little chirping sound. Someone was trying to send a fax to the main telephone line of this credit card machine, and there was no fax machine attached to it, and they couldn't get the fax to stop coming. And so this whole process took about 10 minutes until finally it worked again. And the cashier kept saying, thank you for being so patient. But, it didn't take any effort to be patient. I wanted to buy these things, and I couldn't go without running the card. And I knew he wasn't on purpose trying to send a fax to the credit card machine. And so what was there really to do but just sort of smile about it? Now, it's true, I wasn't late for a meeting, I wasn't late for going to the hospital or anything, but normally we're not. It just feels like we are. And so, in any case, one third idea I would say is trying to cultivate more of a sense of humor. If not by reading funny stories and so on. Master said, read one funny story every day. It's very important to find a way to laugh every day. And then also to see Divine Mother's humor as she plays and gives us entertainment in our lives.
Okay, another question. Master told Swami Kriyananda that his duty was to serve and to meditate, placing service, emphasizing service. Is that true for all disciples who come to Master through Swamiji?
It's a very good question. The actual quote, though the way you've expressed it is perfectly true, is that Master said, your life is one of activity and, intense activity and meditation. And so that's how Swamiji saw that, as Master placed intense activity first. And so that was certainly true for Swamiji, not only because Master had said it, but because in his whole life he saw that kept coming up, that between the two, intense activity and meditation, and his desire for more solitude and meditation, Master and God kept pulling him into intense activity. And he was free at the end of his life as a result of it. I'm sorry for those times when his human heart may have wanted more rest. I have to say I'm grateful beyond measure that he was intensely active in writing books and so on, because it's through all of those that all of us have come to the spiritual path. Having said that, is it true for all of us that therefore we should be more intensely active, or we need to be more intensely active than meditative? I would say no. I would say if you have to pick one because you're not sure, then yes, maybe lean towards intense activity. It's a good default setting, you might say. And certainly coming through Swamiji, it is a part of the culture of Ananda, and again, not even just Ananda, but in terms of this expression of Master's teachings. So it's definitely something to consider and take seriously, but it's by no means everyone's dharma, everyone's right way of being for their own spiritual growth. There was a time at Ananda when there was a lot of energy on the guest retreat and serving the public and being like out on the front lines with them and having them come and opening up the community and so on. That's always been Ananda's a service area, but this was a time when this was being emphasized particularly. And one woman wrote to Swami and said, I don't feel inspiration to serve others in this way. I just feel to be alone and seclude and meditate. And Swamiji said, that's wonderful. Balance is needed in community. I wouldn't want everyone to be on the same bandwagon, just as much as those who are serving outwardly will be balanced by those who are meditating inwardly. So in that sense, it was some were doing the outward activity and some were doing the inner communion. And it was it was according to their own needs and their own next step. So it's not at all a lockstep togetherness that this is the way we have to be. It's more an internal barometer. This is a time when need to be more active. And God tells you, and you know, when we spend too much time in inner communion, but we're actually not having inner communion, we're just having the bedroom or the inner behind the closed door, we get stale. We get restless. We get kind of, I got to go do something. Or we find, again, refreshment in engaging with others. And similarly, when we're way too strung out in outward activity, then it's time to pull in. And if we don't pull in from the whispers of God in our ear, then He'll say, fine, I have no choice but to make you sick. Now, go to bed. And so, if we can catch it before disease forces us down, it's more productive. Any other questions if we have time?
We do have time,
Okay.
and I'm sure that this question is relevant in most of our lives. How do we deal with obnoxious people we are forced to work with?
Very relevant in most of our lives. It's a challenge that all of us face, and I touched on it in a few ways already in terms of, take time away from the person before responding, but this I think you're speaking of more of a systemic, more of a constant thing that happens. Swami had an experience where he was speaking to a woman who, he said, her practice was to just talk in big ideas and abstract things and magical thinking and this happened and that happened and a lot of that. And really, much of it was not grounded in reality or truth or even useful information. So when she came to him to speak, I don't know if he was annoyed, I doubt it, but he found himself looking at his watch saying, okay, how much time is it going to take until I'm out of the situation? And then he stopped and thought, no, God can speak to me through anyone, and let me listen to what God is trying to say to me now. And he said, in that moment, she gave him a piece of advice. She made a useful suggestion that he needed to hear about the direction of the community and so on. And it was very helpful and hadn't come to him any other way. So sometimes God is playing with us through the obnoxious person. He said, for example, if someone is very boring and drones on and on, he said you might make a game of it to, again, look at your watch in this case and say, wow, they have been so boring for 2.5 minutes. And can they do 3? We want to set a record for the most boring, dialogue or monologue. But again, kind-heartedly, feeling that it's God playing with you, not in judgment and so on. Now, another thing that happened to me recently. Someone was talking on and on about things that I wasn't interested in, and I began thinking to myself, how could she possibly be interested to this extent in all these things? But I felt my heart starting to tighten up. And the thought came to me, well, after all, she's not interested in the things you're interested in. And so if you were talking about God or spirituality or Ananda or any of these things, she would be just as bored as you are now. So it made me laugh, and again my heart relaxed and opened up. I still wasn't that interested in anything she had to say, but I was no longer tense or in a bad mood about it. Another thing about dealing with people like that, people that really get on our nerves, is to try to find something positive about the person. Usually it's one habit or one action from the past that has wronged us that makes us feel really bugged by someone. As Master said, if once a person does a strongly bad thing against us, we say the person is bad. And he said, the person is not bad. There's a lot of good in that person. And he said, if you have a piano with one key that's out of tune, you don't say the piano is bad. He said, just fix the key, change the key, and it's fine. So remember, there are 88 keys on the piano. So if this one note of this person's personality, this one key is disturbing us, well, there are 87 other good points probably about them. Or if not 87, then maybe one other good point. I remember a person I had to work with on computers, and I was really bugged by him. And just in his way of being, I think the real reason was he was stressed, and I was picking up on his stress, and it was making me stressed. And so therefore I didn't like him because being around him made me stressed. But it was only because he was stressed, and I didn't have to be affected by his stress. And so it wasn't his fault that I got stressed, it was mine. But still, it was stressful for me. I wasn't able to overcome it. And I thought to myself, this is never going to work if I'm going to be sitting here irritated by him the whole time, especially when I'm trying to help him with the computer, that it'll come out in my tone of voice. I don't want to become impatient and so on. And so I thought, I've got to find something to like about this person. And in the next sort of 5 minutes of his constant talking, he said, well, I remember when I was a police officer for 3 years, and one of the things that happened was, and I thought, my God, he was a police officer, meaning he was running around trying to uphold public safety. He was trying to help people out of difficult spots. He was putting himself perhaps even in harm's way for the sake of others. And what a courageous thing. And so I clung to that, and my respect for him instantly shot through the roof. And then all these other things were insignificant. So try something like that if you can.